Hi guys. So as Andy said, I am Megan Fisher, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how to conquer the blank canvas. In less epic terms, I'm basically just going to discuss my design process. So as I said, my name's Megan. Just to give you a little background on where I'm coming from, I'm a user interface designer and also a front-end developer. I've worked with a lot of different clients, big and small, and I've partnered with lots of awesome designers like Dan Cederholm of SimpleBits and Happy Cock San Francisco. So I've been really lucky to get to do that. I'm also really obsessed with owls, but that doesn't actually have anything to do with my talk. Just wanted to throw it in there. So as a result of all this experience, I've gotten to see a lot of different design processes and kind of steal the parts I like from all my favorite designers. So when we first started design, there's like an infinite number of variables to think about, right? There's like color and all the different ways you can have your navigation and your layout and your type. And for me, this can be really overwhelming when I first start out. So the only way you can get through it, in my mind, is to have a plan of attack. Again, in less dramatic terms, just a process in place. And from what I've seen, everybody has a really different process, and I've been developing mine over several years, but it's still constantly changing. So my goal is just to give you some ideas maybe for the next time you're stuck with a new project and don't know how to get started. So the first step I usually take when beginning a new project is getting to know the project. Next, I want to develop a strategy for finishing that project. Then I start to bring the design to life. And lastly, I really want to make the design shine. So as I said, the first step is to get to know the project. This is arguably the most important step in any design. This is where you want to do your research. I'm going to take frequent pauses in celebration of Liz because I get very thirsty on stage. So anyways, the two parts that you really want to research when you're first beginning a design are the substance aspect of the design and also the treatment of the design. So what this means for me is that I really have to interrogate the client when I get a new project. A lot of people send out questionnaires, or they have a questionnaire that they make the client fill out beforehand, like a request for a proposal. I'd like to do it on a phone call if I can, or over Skype, just so nothing gets lost in email or whatever. But some of the key questions you want to ask when you're trying to flesh out what the substance of the site is like what kind of problem is the client trying to solve by doing this project? Really you want to know what their goals are and what they're expecting to get out of the project. So that kind of covers the substance aspect of your research. And then there's sort of the design side of things where you really want to investigate what kind of mood they're hoping to convey with the site. And I also will ask like what keywords characterize their business. Sometimes I'll ask clients to send me like sites that they like or sites that they don't like and tell me which aspects they appreciate or don't. And I find that can be really helpful with fleshing it out. As I said before, this first step is really the most important step in the whole project. And the more time that you spend on research up front, the better your project is likely to turn out. I've had clients where I'll say, what's the one most important thing on your homepage? What is the primary goal of your site? And I'll get back like a 5-paragraph essay. Sometimes people don't really know why they need to do a redesign or what they're trying to build. And it's important that you flesh that out before you really undertake the bulk of your work. The reason for that is that with these questions answered, that's really going to act as a compass for the rest of your project. And the answers you get out of that questionnaire process are going to direct every decision you make along the way, as I'll demonstrate. So this is the site that we're going to be building today. It's actually my site, and this is a redesign that I worked on a while ago. It might seem weird to talk about a redesign for a client process description, but the process I use when redesigning my site is pretty much the same as what I use with every other client. It's the only way I can get myself to be kind of objective about it. And really the only difference is that when you're working on a redesign, you don't have all the deadlines, which I kind of wish I did have deadlines, because then maybe I would have launched this thing 3 months ago when I started it. But this is what we're ultimately going to be building today. As I said, the first step of any project is to meet the client and really understand what it is that they want and why they're creating whatever it is they're creating. So, as I said earlier, I'm Meagan Fisher. I'm a freelance web designer and I like owls. And when talking about the treatment for this site, I really wanted something whimsical and sort of nostalgic with like a little bit of a kitschy kind of feel. And the reason I wanted to redesign was to kind of promote my work a little bit more than I am now, and also encourage potential clients to get in touch with me and make it a little bit easier for them to do that. Oh, so one thing I want to say about this is that this is kind of like a mission statement for the project. And it's kind of dorky, but I'll actually type something like this up for every new project I undertake and keep it in the project folder. And I refer back to it a lot, because sometimes when you're in the middle of a design, you might see something really cool that a fellow designer has done and think, oh, I really want to implement that endless scrolling page technique on my page, or on this project I'm working on now. And when I come back to this mission statement, I can sort of evaluate that idea against what the client's goals are and make sure that I'm not just doing something because it's fun, and I want to ensure that it's really what the client needs for their project. So I would encourage everybody to create a mission statement for every new project they undertake. The second step, once you have a really good understanding of what it is that the client wants, is to formulate a strategy for moving forward. And again, for me, this breaks down into 2 parts. You want to create a strategy for the content, which for me means creating a wireframe, something you're pretty familiar with probably. But you want to think about what parts of the design should get visual priority and what kind of layout is going to cater best to the substance of the site. The second part is something maybe not everybody does, but you want to create a plan for the design aspect of the site as well. And for me, this means creating kind of like a cheat sheet or an inspiration board for the style of the site. So we'll begin by putting together some wireframes. Wireframes can be really basic, or they can be incredibly complex. There are people who spend entire days in OmniGraffle, and for some projects, I think that totally makes sense. But for me, depending on the size of the project, but a lot of the times, this is what my wireframes start out looking like. I actually have a notebook full of these on my desk, and they're just kind of rough sketches that I do, usually with a Sharpie. And it's nice because then I can refer back to this, so if I'm doing a couple different sites that have like a similar content, then I've got sort of an idea book ready to go. But this is where my projects usually start out. For me, I like to create my mockups using HTML. I try to avoid Photoshop as much as I can, just because I think it's sort of a nightmare to use, and it doesn't render text very well. And also because I think there's a lot of benefits to beginning your project in the medium that it's ultimately going to end up in. So if you're creating a mock-up for the web, I think it's cool to do it in markup first. This ensures that the focus is more on the content, and also that you're beginning with a foundation of like solid web standards-based markup. It's also good because then you can let the client see some of those interaction elements that they would miss out on if they were just looking at static PSDs. So I did an article about this last year for 24 Ways. So if you want to read more about that part of the process, I'd encourage you to check that out. But anyway, so the first step is to consider what the content's going to be. It's awesome if you can if you have content ready to go initially, if you're working with a content writer or something. But if not, just keep in mind the goals that the client and you agreed upon in the beginning and work that into the markup initially. So the next step for me, once I've got the solid just HTML that's based in standards, is to style it to look more like the wireframe I sketched earlier using CSS3. And again, you want to consider the layout elements and how they tie in with the client's goals. So for example here, if the goal is to really promote the work more and have the emphasis of the site be more on the work I'm doing, then I might have like a featured project and then a gallery of recent work. And as you can see, the primary call to action, or maybe not the primary, but a major call to action here is a link to the contact page, which was the secondary goal for the project. So that's just a larger view of the wireframe that's been created in CSS. And sometimes during this process, I'll also start to incorporate color a little bit, just to bounce some ideas off the client as to the color scheme and make sure that the tone that I have in mind for the project lines up with what they were ultimately envisioning. So for me, I really like to use a grid when I'm creating my wireframes. Some people find that that's a little early on to be worrying about incorporating grids and measuring margins and columns, but I used to just kind of guess at it, and I found that my wireframes weren't really as clean looking and readable. So there's a lot of advantages to working with a grid in your design. And if you don't know about that, which I'm sure many of you do, you might want to check out 960.gs or thegridsystem.org. So this is the wireframe that I showed you in the previous step. And there it is with the grid that I'm using for this project. So at this point, you really want to stop and show your wireframe to the client. A lot of times I've sent out the wireframe, and again, even though I've spent a lot of time on the research process in the first step, the response I've gotten from the client has been, oh wait, this is not at all what I imagined, this isn't what I thought I wanted. So you want to just constantly be kind of evaluating to make sure you're on target with their ultimate goals. And that's a good point to do that. Not all my clients look like that, but some of them do, in my head. So as I said, there's kind of a two-part process for me when I'm creating a plan for the project. And the first step, as I just explained, is wireframing. But secondly, I like to gather inspiration for the project that sort of lines up with the tone and the treatment that I discussed with the client early on. And that's just something I can refer back to throughout the process to make sure that my aesthetic is lining up with what they envisioned and what we talked about early on. So this is just an example of like the inspiration board that I created for Owltastic. So yeah, I like to pull inspiration from lots of different resources. I won't necessarily create a board, but I do bookmark images a lot on sites like Found and Tumblr and things like that. At one point, I jokingly had this as Foultastic in my talk, and I guess I forgot to change this slide back. So that's actually not a typo, it's just me being silly. Anyway, so when I'm looking for inspiration, one thing I really pay attention to is the color scheme for the elements I'm looking at. These are some different materials that I collected for the Owltastic design, and you can see they all have sort of that subdued, it's like muted colors combined with bold colors, and it's got kind of a nostalgic feel. And I might not actually take the color selection tool and pull the colors from this, but it's that kind of, I know the look and feel that I want, and so I can use these materials to create a color palette. So that's just a few of them. Along with looking for interesting colors when I'm looking for inspiration, I'll pay attention to typography and try to collect a lot of materials that have typography in the style that I want to use for the site. So these are just some interesting prints and things like that that I found that had type that were sort of in the style that I wanted to emulate for that project. Excuse me. I also really like to use inspiration from offline resources. So I'll try to go to museums in my area. I spend a lot of time looking at books for specific like print artists from the 40s and 50s and things like that. I love looking at like old WPA posters. So book design is another really good one. I think it's important as web designers that we pull research from, or inspiration from offline resources. That way we're not just getting caught up in whatever the web trends are for the moment, and we're making sure that sort of our style and our voice comes through in our designs, and it's not just about whatever's popular for the time. So I try to always make my designs inspired by materials collected offline. Okay, oops. So once we've assembled our materials for inspiration and created a wireframe for the project, the next step is to start to finally bring the design to life. And for me, where that really happens is when I start to integrate the typography and also the color and the shape into the design. Again, so when you're thinking about the typography, you just want to ask yourself, what kind of typeface is going to fit the style of my project? And how can I use typography to really emphasize the elements that are most important to the client's goals? And it's kind of the same thing with color and shape. You want to think about what's going to fit the style of the project in terms of, like mine, I wanted it to be whimsical and kind of fun, but also how can I use the color and shape to really pinpoint those goals that the client had and emphasize the correct elements throughout the design. So one thing I like to do, and I've been trying to do more of lately, is use font face friendly fonts in my designs. Having a unique font and something that the user maybe isn't accustomed to seeing in a website will kind of add another level of visual interest, and also it can be used to direct their eye throughout the page. That's a list of a few resources that you can use online. There's tons of solutions out there right now for using font face. Typekit is a really great one, and if you can afford it, which I think probably everybody can, maybe, I would definitely recommend it. They have hundreds of fonts, and they're all really high quality. It's very easy to use, and it's 100% legal. You don't have to worry about the end user license agreement for any of the fonts on there because they've already done that research. It does have a cost associated with it. I think it starts at $25. I have here a year, but that seems too low, so maybe it's a month. I'll have to double check that. But anyways, it's got a subscription service attached to it, but it's nice because you don't have to worry about whether or not it's going to work in other browsers, and I would definitely recommend checking them out. There's also Font Squirrel. That's another resource you can look at. They have hundreds of fonts as well. The quality of those fonts tends to vary. I don't think they're quite as selective as Typekit is, and it's not quite as easy to use. It's still fairly easy, but they actually generate a font kit for you instead of just a script that you can include in the top of your page. Another thing you have to be careful with if you're going to use Font Squirrel is that they let you upload any font you want to create a font kit from, and as such, they're not verifying that it's legal before you upload it. So you have to do the research and make sure that the end user license agreement allows you to use those fonts online. But Font Squirrel is free, which is great. And lastly, well, not lastly, because there's hundreds, but the last one I'm going to talk about is Google, and they have a font face service out as well. It's got about 20 fonts, I think, a little over 20 fonts that you can use to embed. And again, it's very easy to use. It's just a script you throw in the top of your page, and it's free. So that's kind of nice. The key to using font face correctly, I think, in our designs is to make sure that we're being subtle about it. You're probably going to get sick of hearing this from me. I think it's a challenge with web designers now that we have font face introduced. I know for me, at least, when I first started playing with it, I wanted to use it on everything, and I wanted my blog to look like it was handwritten by a 14-year-old because that seemed cool. And I had to kind of step it back a notch and think, just because I don't have to use Georgia on everything doesn't mean that I have to go completely over the top with it. So I think that's just something to keep in mind, is to be subtle. Jason Santamaria, who has a studio of his own and is an awesome designer, He also works at Typekit. He did a really good write-up about how to use the fonts that are now available to us, and that's on a list of parts, so I would definitely check that out. That's kind of a long excerpt, but basically, he just argues that if we're going to use a very embellished font or something with a lot of personality, we should make sure that we use it at a larger size so that it ensures that it's very readable. And maybe just be careful about how many fonts you're using if you're going to use something that's very embellished. So the way I like to use sort of bolder fonts in FontFace is to break up the text, and I'll use a font that tends to really contrast with the body type. This kind of creates a visual hierarchy so that you don't need a lot of other embellishments like borders and boxes and things like that. You can rely on the typography to break up your design, which is nice. So this is the design as it was before, just using Helvetica. And here it is updated to use Chunk, which is a font by the League of Movable Type. I would recommend checking them out. They offer free fonts for download or embedding, and they're very cool. But you can see here, I'm using a slab serif font face, which again kind of ties in with that vintage sort of country whimsical theme that I wanted to stick with. And it breaks up the body text very well because it's kind of contrasting to the simplicity of the Helvetica that's used in the body text. And it's also just a great way to draw the user's eye to the most important points. You can see it's on the navigation, the calls to action, and the headlines. And it just kind of makes the design more scannable and usable. So we've talked about type, but I also want to make sure I address the color in the design because right now it's sort of lacking. I like to use really bold colors to direct the user's eye towards the most important elements, and I always make sure that links and buttons are in very high contrast to the rest of the color scheme. So this is how it was before when I had it in the wireframe and hadn't really given much thought to the color. And here it is updated so that only the most important elements on the page are using that really bold red color. You can see the call to action, the navigation elements, and the area where I talk about my availability is now the boldest and most attention-grabbing parts of the page. And all that was just done with color. I also rearranged some elements for this stage, but, and that, of course, will happen in any design process. So in addition to thinking about the color and type, during this phase, I also like to play around with using some really unique shaped elements in my designs. I'm a big fan of kind of these frilly sort of embroidered shapes, but a very simple one that you can use is, of course, the pill-shaped button, and that's a classic thing we see throughout web design. And it's great because using CSS3, you can now make that very easily with border radius. And there's tons of like button generators out there that will create these really cool pill-shaped buttons for you just using CSS3, which is nice. So here's the design as it was before with just the colors and the type addressed. And then here it is updated to have interesting shapes throughout. So you can see this is maybe a little bit more over the top than what I would normally do, but I just wanted to show some of the ones I like to play with. The use of flags in design and arrows and things like that just helps to direct your eye throughout the design. So a lot of times when I do these talks, people tell me afterwards that they couldn't see any of the stuff I was talking about because the contrast was too low. So if you have your laptops or if you want to do it later, I've got the screenshots for some of these online, and you can check out that last one at that address. So now that we've got the design looking pretty good, it's got some interesting colors, some cool type, neat shapes are in there. The layout's pretty solid and lining up with the goals. We really want to just start to make it shine. And this is where we implement some of those details that really set your design apart. The way I try to do this is by thinking about lighting effects within the design and also texture within the design. These two elements are great because they can give your design kind of a tangible feel and make something that's on the web feel like a printed material that you could hold in real life, which is just sort of a nice way of bringing some personality to your designs. With CSS3, this is a lot easier to do now as well. Before, when I would try to layer textures and different illustrations and things like that into the background of my design, it required the use of some pretty unsemantic markup and a lot of things like div container inner 2, and things like that. So the great thing about CSS3 is that you can use multiple background images to give your design this kind of flair. The syntax for multiple background images is pretty simple. It's basically the same as the background image syntax we use now, but with comma-separated images. So here, if I was going to put like an engraved picture of an owl behind my content, this is how I might do it. So a lot of people ask me, like, how do I create some of the illustrations and the textures and things like that that I use in my designs? It's really just a combination of layer effects and hue and saturation in Photoshop. I guess this is the one place where I will use Photoshop. As far as I know, there's no way to do it with CSS3. But yeah, so if you have something like a cardboard texture and you apply an illustration in front of it, you can play with the different blend modes that are available, like multiply, overlay, things like that, in the layers palette. And that will just kind of blend that illustration onto whatever texture you choose. And then you can create a hue and saturation layer to adjust the coloring. So it's pretty easy and it's kind of fun. I also get a lot of people asking me where I find all these ridiculous illustrations that I use and everything. And it's really just Wikipedia. If you go to commons.wikimedia.com, you can search for like anything. And I usually just type engraving of whatever. So I think like in the last one, it was like engraving of hippo. And I found this incredible thing, which I don't even know what the context is. I'm surprised I didn't get sidetracked researching that. But yeah, so something to check out, and it can be a way to make your designs a little more playful. I always like the vintage kind of look, so that's one way to do it. If you're looking for just straight up textures and patterns, here's a few resources you can check out. Yeah, like I love using kind of cardboard textures in mine, and I think I got those from Texture King, but there's all kinds of different ones. I've also included a link to an article about multiple background images, since I didn't go into too much detail with that. That's on Jonathan Snook's site, so you can also just Google it. So again, the key when you're using textures in your design and illustrations and things like this is to just make sure that you're subtle about it. Obviously, we don't want to distract from the content or anything like that with our ridiculous hippo backgrounds. And yeah, it's just important to make sure that it's subtle. So here's our design before, just sort of flat without any texture or anything added in. And there it is with different cardboard textures, some of the imagery that I was talking about. You can see the engraved owl there. It's actually a little bit too high contrast, I think, in this case, but I just wanted to make sure you guys could see it. So normally I would definitely dial it down more than that. But yeah, you can see the kind of difference it makes, how it just brings the design to life a bit more. So in addition to talking about texture, you also want to start thinking about lighting effects and how you can use those in your design. I've listed 3 really quick ways that you can incorporate lighting effects in your design here. These are just some of the ones that I kind of do by default. For added depth, you can use CSS3's box shadow and text shadow effects to sort of set the elements off the page. I didn't want to go into the syntax of all that because it's a little bit complicated and this isn't really a CSS3 talk, but I actually did a write-up about how I use text shadow and box shadow in design combined with RGBA. So if you just Google Owltastic in CSS3, it's the very first result if you want to know more about that. But using text shadow and box shadow is a really good way to give your designs sort of like a letterpressed or an embossed effect. I also like to layer a lot of soft gradients throughout my design. And so before CSS3, I had this big library of pinged gradients that I would use. I had like shadows and like glow effects and things like that. And I also like to layer sort of a soft radial gradient behind all my designs, not all, but some of the designs. And it kind of gives that illusion that there's a light source hitting the page. So that's one technique you can use. Again, with CSS3, there's a lot of ways you can do those effects, gradients, and things like that in the browser, which is great. And I would encourage you to research that as well. Lastly, I like to use double borders around a lot of the edged elements to create kind of a sharper edge around things. Again, the way I would do that before CSS3 is to create like a 2-pixel image in Photoshop. One part would be dark and one part would be light, and I would just adjust the opacity of that. And when you apply it to an edge, it just gives it that sort of hard edge effect. And people also use this to break up list items and things like that. You can do that, again, with CSS3 using box shadow. So that's something to think about, too. So here's the design with just the texture applied. And here it is again with lighting effects added. Again, I feel like some of the differences between the two might be a little bit hard to perceive on the monitor. So I've put that up online if you want to check out the final version of the mockup at owltastic.com/talk/final. But yeah, that's it. So we've gone through the process of creating a mockup from scratch using the steps I discussed earlier. The first step, I'm just going to review the steps quickly that we took. The first step is to create a mission statement for the project, where you sum up the client's design goals and content goals. The next step is to create sort of a wireframe. This can be sketched or an omnigraphal, or whatever software you like to use. I just prefer to use one of those two. Then I like to turn the wireframe into a grayscale version of the site that's just sort of a rough layout using CSS3 or CSS. I always want to make sure that I'm considering a grid when I go through this step. I also like to have inspiration on hand for the project that I can refer back to when I get in a design rut. The next step is to start thinking about the typography in the design, and I would encourage you to play with the fonts that are available to us now through FontFace. Then we start to consider the color in the design and tone some elements down and really bring forth the important elements in the design with bolder colors. Then we can incorporate shape into the design, and again, just really emphasize the important elements and the calls to action using unique shapes. Next, we would incorporate texture into the design and give it a tangible feel with papery textures or some kind of grain. And you can use multiple background images to make this easier. And then lastly, we would adjust the lighting effects. And that's it. Thank you guys so much for listening to me today. And I'm online, so if you have any feedback for me, I would love to hear it either in person or on Twitter. I also upload a lot of the images that I use for inspiration to Tumblr, so if you'd like to follow me on there, you might find something that could be of use to you. And all my recent work is on Dribbble, or snippets of it are anyways. I'm terrible about remembering to update my portfolio, so if you look on there, you can see some of the stuff I've been working on. And yeah.